Okay, about 2.5 years ago, I was at a friend's house spending the night, and we were just hanging out when his brother called him in the living room, shouting for him, bloody murder, told him he had to see something. So we both went in the living room, and he was watching something on TV, and I just, off the bat, I thought it was wrestling or something or a movie, because it was two guys, and they were fighting each other, and they were beating crap out of each other. And it was crazy, it blew my mind, because these guys, they're punching each other, and kicking each other, and throwing each other all over the place. And I sat there, I just watched this, and I was amazed, because I said, these guys, how do they stand their tape pad? How do they do this? And it went on for 25 minutes with these guys kicking each other, punching each other. And I said, is this real? This can't be real. Is this even legal? So, I went home, and I spent the next 2.5 years of my life finding out that it not only was legal, it was considered an art form. It was considered mixed martial arts. In fact, it wasn't even American, and it's been around for a very, very long time. I spent the last 3 years of my life studying it, dedicating myself to it, and finding out all about the men and the women who participate in it each and every day of their life. Some for a hobby, and some for a job. Now, everything that I really studied, it all came down, and it all boiled down to 3 words, which all came down to one acronym: the Ultimate Fighting Championship, the UFC. Today, I'd like for us to take an insider look into the UFC, into its history, its origins that go all the way back to the 1880s, all the way in Brazil. And I'd like to dispel some of the more common misunderstandings about MMA, some of the dangers of MMA. Well, it's violent, people die every day doing it. I'd like for us to take a look at the cultural impact that UFC has had on today's generation, and I hope to inform a lot of you about the reality of the UFC and MMA, and not just the flash and the violence. Okay, I'd like to begin with a brief little history of the UFC. One of the more common things you'll hear when you think of UFC, you'll hear the term jiu-jitsu. And jiu-jitsu originated in Brazil. Jiu-jitsu started around the 1800s and 1880s in Brazil. And it was originated in Brazil, but it was perfected by the Gracie family. By Helio Gracie was the first practitioner, or one of the first practitioners of jiu-jitsu. And he took this sport, and he took this art, he perfected it to the point where they would commonly hold tournaments in Brazil. They call them Vale Tudo tournaments, which roughly translate from Brazilian to American. It means no rules, no regulations. And basically, these guys would just fight. They would do whatever they could win to fight. They wouldn't stab each other or shoot each other, but they would fist fight. They would bring each other to the ground. However you could win. You could break your opponent's leg, make him tap out, choke him out unconscious. Okay. Now, the Gracies, they were very proud of what they had accomplished with jiu-jitsu, and they wanted to show this to everyone, not just Brazil. So they took this, and they got with some promoters who were looking to put together something to capitalize on the current boom. Wrestling was really popular, Hulk Hogan and Bret Hart. And they wanted to match that with something, so they put together something that they were going to call War of the Worlds. And after a while, that idea fell apart, so they changed it to the Ultimate Fighting Championship, which is the very first poster you'll see there. And it was shown on pay-per-view. And they brought in about 8 people. It was an 8-man tournament. They brought in people who practiced sumo wrestling, shoot fighting, jiu-jitsu, just many karate, just a lot of different forms of martial arts and hand-to-hand combat. Now they put this tournament together, and it was an extreme success. The UFC president, Dana White, the current president himself, said that these men never intended for this show to take off the level it did. It was supposed to be a one-and-done thing. And they didn't have a clue that they were creating an actual sport when they put the first UFC together. It was just, let's see how this works, maybe we'll get a TV show out of it. Well, it was doing extremely well. They had several more shows, but after a while they decided they wanted to make it legitimate. So they had to add some rules and some regulations to it. So I'd like to transition now to the rules of the sport, making it more legit. Because in the first UFCs, it was okay, it was good, they were fighting each other, but there were no actual rules. In today's UFC, you can't poke someone in the eye, you can't kick someone in the groin. Back in the old UFC, you could pull hair, you could poke eyes, do whatever you wanted to win. Now, this wasn't setting very well with the athletic commissions, with governors, because they called it human cockfighting. So they wanted to make this a sport. They wanted to show that it wasn't about violence, it was about competition. So they added a very strict rule book. They implemented a lot of rules: no eye gouging, no hair pulling. And around the time of the 10th or 11th UFC, they had a very strict set of rules. Like I said, they had introduced a very strict rule book. They made sure that they had referees in there making sure that everyone followed the rule book to a T. They stopped the fights a lot sooner. The fights didn't end as abruptly because there were more rules implemented, so people couldn't poke eyes or pull hair to win the way they usually did in the first tournaments. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions with the UFC and MMA in general is that it's not safe. It's that the people get killed doing it. People get brain damage. People die from doing it. In the 19-year history of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, there's not been one death that's ever occurred. There's never been one serious injury, one life-altering injury. People get bruised, people break their bones with those hills. No one has ever been killed, and no one has ever been lost a limb or lost years off their life because of competing in the UFC. The UFC, they provide thorough medical checks for every fighter after every fight, including scans of their brain, their major organs, their bones. They tend to any injuries received, any broken bones, any bruises. They take very good care of their fighters, and UFC is held at a level that it's a lot safer than boxing, actually, because once a person's knocked out one time in the UFC, they can't choose to get back up and compete. The fight's over, the referee will stop it on the spot. Now, the thing comes around is, can anyone compete in MMA? I mean, something like this, two guys fighting, two big guys like this, you have to be a big football player, you have to be big and strong to do MMA, even just to practice it, because it's very grueling. No, anyone can compete in MMA. According to research completed and submitted by the Biomedical Central, studies have indicated that fall strategies based on martial arts fall techniques reduce the impact forces during accidental falls. These were applied to people who had osteoporosis, and it helped them that when they fell, it would actually, when they implemented falls used in judo, which is commonly used in MMA, it would actually help them from falling and breaking a bone. They would use strategies and techniques that judo fighters used to catch themselves a certain way to keep themselves from popping their hip out of place or cracking their hip bone or breaking their arm. Okay. Now I'd like to bring us to our third main point, UFC in today's society. Now, was bringing MMA to the public a bad idea? Was introducing something like this to the general public? Was introducing something like this to the general public bad? No, it wasn't. MMA and UFC, they bring together hundreds of cultures. You'll have people from Anderson Silva from Manatipa, Brazil, fighting Chuck Liddell from San Luis Obispo, California. You'll have Fedor LOL from Russia fighting someone like BJ Penn from Hilo, Hawaii. You'll have people from all over the world brought together. It's a cultural, I can't think of the word. It's all cultures. You get it. Okay. UFC today, it's a phenomenon. It's very common. You'll see labels like tap out, affliction everywhere, which were all started for MMA. Tap out was sold out of a car trunk, and the first UFC shows, tap out started in the parking lot. Charles Lewis sold tap out shirts for the first time out of his car trunk at the first UFC show. Now those shirts sell for about $50, $60 at the mall. You see everybody wearing them. Okay, so I would just like to jump into our conclusion that I found out that from the first story I told you about the two guys fighting at my friend's house, I went home and I looked up more about that fight, and I found out that those two men were Forrest Griffin and Clinton Rampage Jackson, right there. And I found out that they were both veteran fighters and were new to the sport. And what really amazed me and what really drew me in about what I seen, it wasn't all the kicking and the punching and the bleeding, but it was the fact that after the fight they shook each other's hand and they congratulated each other. And that's what really made me a fan. It wasn't the violence, and it wasn't the punching, it was the kicking, it was respect. It was about honor. It wasn't about titles, and it wasn't about blood bones, and it wasn't about looking cool. It was about respecting each other, and it was about competing professionally. I believe that the UFC did the rest of the world a favor by bringing the MMA out of the quiet dojos in Brazil. And I would encourage all of you to maybe, if you haven't already watched at least one fight, to go look one up at least once in your life. Thank you very much for hearing me out today. It was always an honor to talk about this sport and to defend it. The UFC, ladies and gentlemen.